Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. Okay, so the listing agreement, as you guys know it, is gone. And with that, we have officially ushered in the zero compensation era of for buyers agents of real estate. So I got a message from CRMLS. I saw a message from CRMLS. Some of you guys may have seen it also when you logged into CRMLS. I don't know how many of you pay attention to your messages that pop up on your dashboard. But what it said was, if you are taking a listing with the new RLAS that was released yesterday, you cannot offer any compensation in the MLS, even though the MLS, the offers of compensation for buyers brokers are still in there in the MLS until August 13th. If your listing is taken today forward, yesterday forward, with the new RLAS that's dated 7/24 on the top, you cannot offer compensation in the MLS. Okay. So it's, even though the changes to how we do our business, where we offer compensation and do all those things, doesn't start until August 17th. Technically, it's really started now with the listing agreement. Okay. So just know that you cannot, if you take a listing from today forward with the new listing agreement, cannot offer compensation in the MLS. Okay. So that BAC section of the MLS that still exists for the next couple of weeks, you're going to have to put 0 in there. I'm going to do things a little different than I normally do with the listing agreement, which means I'm not going to go through the agency disclosure form because it hasn't changed. It's the same. And I want to make sure that we get through as much of, if not all of the listing agreement as we can today. Hopefully finish it. Okay. All right. So before I share screen, any other questions? Any questions at all before I share the screen? Okay. All right. Here we go. We're going to share. Let me do this first. Let me jump down. All right. All right. Desktop 2. What you guys should be looking at right now is the residential listing agreement, right? The RLA revised 7/24. And from the beginning, I know that I kind of shared with you guys the drafts, and they made a little bit of changes to the drafts at the last minute, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. But this is the final listing agreement. This is the only listing agreement that's available to you in zip forms at this moment. So if you're taking a listing now, this is the listing agreement you're going to use. Okay. So let's start going through it. Okay, so date prepared, pretty straightforward. Obviously, for writing a listing, today is the date it was prepared. That doesn't mean that's going to be our start date. Okay, that doesn't mean it's going to be our start date. Sellers' names, all of the sellers' names, if that happens to be an entity like a trust or a corporation, right? That is the full name that's going to go in there. And again, like, I'm going over this as if we're filling out the listing just like we've done in the past, but we're going to talk about the changes. Remember, like, I would always make sure that the names on the listing agreement match what their legal names are or what's on title, just to make sure that everything is clear. We've had issues in the past where people don't pay attention to what's on the title and they don't have all the sellers on. Remind your sellers that there's no need to add people to a listing agreement that aren't on title. It's funny, lately I've been having conversations with agents where they're saying, oh, well, my sellers want to add their kids to the listing agreement or the purchase agreement, but they're not on title. It doesn't make sense. Don't do it. Just the sellers need to sign. Don't create more work for yourself when it's unnecessary. Okay. So just the people that are on title, all of the names, make sure everybody is on there. Okay. Make sure all of the sellers are on there. Seller's name, broker name, Century 21 All Stars, obviously. That's what's going to go there. The exclusive and irrevocable right to sell or exchange the real property described as, the address, obviously. So we'll just use here for now so we can kind of fill that out. And that's in the city of Pico Rivera, right? And We are in the county of Los Angeles. That's pretty straightforward. And our zip code is 90660. Okay. I'm not going to put the parcel number in. If you have the parcel number, great. If you don't want to put the parcel number in, as long as there's a street address, if there's more than one address or there is no street address, like you get with vacant properties, obviously you have to use the parcel number. All right. Terms of this listing agreement, paragraph 2. You see here, this says paragraph 2, terms of listing agreement. The items in this paragraph are contractual terms of the agreement. Referenced paragraphs provide further explanation. This form is 7 pages. Seller is advised to read all 7 pages. Now, just like the new purchase agreement, it's gone into this grid format. Everything that we negotiate is paragraph 2. These paragraphs that you see here, paragraph number like 4G, 4B, 4C, those are explanation paragraphs that go into more detail about that item that we're talking about. But if we're talking about negotiations, if we're looking at something, we want to reference something as a negotiation, that reference to that paragraph is paragraph 2. A1 would be about the listing period. If we were referencing, A2 would be the listing price. So all of this is paragraph 2. Okay, that's it. So let's get into it. Paragraph A1, the listing period. You see here in parentheses, maximum length. The maximum length of a listing agreement now is 24 months. That's it. So if the listing period exceeds 24 months on a residential 1 to 4 units, this agreement is void unless seller is a corporation, LLC, or partnership. So if it is some kind of an entity like an LLC, corporation, or partnership, they don't get that protection. It can be a longer listing agreement period. But for everybody else, the mom and pops, the regular owners, the people that this is their principal residence, or just the normal investors that hold on to income properties, it can only be 24 months maximum. Now, I don't think any of you guys are taking 24-month listings, but it's good to know that there is now a maximum amount of time that you can't exceed. So you have to have a begin date and you have to have an end date. It is required. This contract is unenforceable if you do not have a begin date or an end date. And it's weird that this week alone, I've had conversations with 2 different agents that they turned in listing agreements without a begin date or end date. Actually, it was 3. They turned in listing agreements without a begin date or an end date. That listing is invalid. So regardless if the seller signed it, regardless if they agreed to all the terms and you want to start marketing it, if somebody else comes in, sees that and says, hey, listen, you don't have a valid listing, that listing is voidable and they could sign a listing with somebody else. Okay. So keep in mind. So let's say that we're going to do this one for 6 months. So that takes us to November of 2024. Okay. List price, what we're listing it for. Let's just say we're listing this for 900,000, right? Did I do enough zeros? I think so. No, that's 9 million. Sure. If we could get 9 million for the building, which probably get more, 900,000, right? So we got our list price. It's there in words and in numbers. It does that for you. This paragraph 2B is if this is something like a probate or a manufactured home, we would check that box. And we got, obviously there's a little issue there. We would check that box, and that box would then include the manufactured home listing addendum. Or if it were a probate, it would also, there's an error obviously here. Or we could add the probate, or it could be both manufactured home and probate. And that's going to give me this error over and over again. That would add, thanks, Danny. I'm not too worried about the 6 months being real or not. I know I said 6 months and I only went to November, but I appreciate it. Thank you. I just counted quickly. Thank you though for pointing that out. This would add 2 addendums that would be specific to those type of sales for a manufactured home or for a probate or conservatorship or guardianship. That would be it. Okay. That's what you need to check. It will add those forms for you. Now let's get into the major changes, which all of you guys are scared of and are making you fear the date of 8/17, but it is what's coming. And this is what we're going to have to deal with. So Let's hit it head on, right? Paragraph 2C1, compensation to seller's broker. This is only the seller side of the transaction. So now, when I'm on my listing presentation and I'm negotiating for compensation, the only compensation that I'm going to reference and negotiate here is what I am going to get paid to represent them. So, in the past, in the listing agreement that existed up until 2 days ago, when we would talk about compensation in that first section of the listing agreement, what that would be total compensation paid to the buyer's broker, which included the compensation that we were offering to a cooperating broker in order to entice them. That's no longer the case. Okay. So what this is only what you're paying me to represent you. So it could be 2%, 3%, 4%, whatever it is that you've negotiated, whatever strength you have in negotiation, whatever value you've proved to the seller, this is what they're paying you solely to be their listing agent. Okay. So in this case, let's stick with the norm, which is the 3% that we would ask for, right? So 3%, or you could do a compensation schedule. And what that means is on a compensation schedule says maybe if the list price, if the sales price exceeds the list price by a certain amount, they pay you more of a percentage. Or if it sells for less than, they pay you a certain percentage. You can put all of those terms. Okay. You can put all of those terms. You click this and you can attach an addendum basically that becomes a compensation schedule and says, hey, besides just paying me this 3% of whatever it sells for, there are some terms to that. Right. That is something that you could add in. You could say, hey, listen, if I get you X amount, you're going to pay me 3. If I get you X amount, you're going to pay me 2. If I get you more than that, I'm going to get 4. You can negotiate that. And that's what the compensation schedule would show. Okay. Now, if maybe on the compensation schedule, the thing is this, is that they're trying to eliminate us compelling the seller to pay compensation to the buyer's broker. And that's why it's gone. So I know already there's going to be a question where people are going to say, oh, if I put on the compensation schedule that the seller is going to pay me 6% so that I could offer 3. Feasibly, you could do that. I mean, you could put whatever you want on the compensation schedule. Is that going to fall under the umbrella of, are we compelling the seller to pay compensation to the buyer's broker? I don't know. So I can't tell you that that's going to be some kind of violation of how it's going to work. Obviously, we're not offering compensation in the MLS any longer. So that part we're still going to be fine with. They would still have to negotiate with you on how you're going to pay that compensation with each offer, like we talked about with that SPBB, right? And the buyer broker and buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. So potentially, could you in a compensation schedule say, seller will pay me 3% to represent them. They will pay me 6% if there's a cooperating broker that I'm cooperating. I mean, you could probably structure that somehow. Again, I am not an attorney, so I can't tell you for sure if that's going to be super enforceable or if that's going to be some kind of violation of that settlement agreement. But if your seller's willing to pay the compensation, if they don't have an issue with signing that contract and you telling them, hey, by the way, you're not obliged, you're not obligated to offer compensation to a buyer. There's nothing that requires you to offer compensation to a buyer, to a buyer's agent. But if we want to get your property sold and this is the price you want to get, here's what we're going to do. And this is how much you're going to pay me. And I'm going to offer it out. Or, or you leave it like this and you negotiate every offer dependent on the value and the strength of that offer and having that buyer's agent request that seller to pay it like they would on any credit. So I think that maybe what we're going to head into more than us getting paid and paying somebody else is we're going to head into it. Hey, the strength of your offer is going to depend on how you get paid buyer's agent. So for you guys as buyer's agents, the importance on getting listings is quadrupled with the changes in how compensation works. So if you were heavily dependent on buyers, or if you considered yourself a buyer's agent and all you worked with was buyers because you thought it was easier or faster, those days are pretty much gone, right? You're going to have to do listing presentations for your buyers. So the amount of effort and presentation and value that agents would have to present to a seller to commit a seller to pay me a commission and trust me to get their home sold, you're going to have to do the same thing with buyers. You're going to have to sit down with them and show them what the value is for them to pay you. Okay. Why they want to hire you, why they want to work with you. It's not going to be you choosing to work with a buyer. It's going to be a buyer choosing to work with you. And especially those buyers that have the ability to pay compensation if there is no compensation from a seller, right? So that's going to be even tougher to find those. So the way I look at it, that 3%, the compensation you're getting paid, I would push all the compensation for buyer's agents onto the buyer's agent's negotiating skills and the strength of the offer. Okay, so hold on a second. So Bertha's got her hand up. So first I'll go to Bertha. Go ahead, Bertha.
Okay, thank you. So I already presented to a seller with 5% commission, and she agrees. On the next line, it says additional compensation to seller broker. And I told her, if I do represent the buyer, I'm going to bring down to 4%. So then I will put 1% here, right? On the C2.
Excuse me, your there's some feedback there. I think somebody's speaker is going through your microphone. So no, I'm gonna mute you. Okay, so if you had a listing agreement previously that said 5% and it was the old listing agreement, that stands the way it is. And if you double end it and you say, okay, well, if I double end it, if I find the buyer, it's 4%, that stands as is. If you're using this form, okay, if you're using this, if you signed the listing with this listing agreement, you get paid 3% for representing the seller. You would still have to have a buyer representation agreement and broker compensation with the buyer that you're going to work with as a double lending agent that shows the compensation that you're being paid by that buyer. You still have to request that compensation from the seller. Just like if you were the buyer's agent, it doesn't change. There is no automatic, I get paid X for representing the buyer. Now, maybe I could put that in the compensation schedule instead of doing the 3%. Part of that would be like, I get 3% for representing the seller, regardless of who the buyer's agent is. I get, or the seller agrees to pay me a total of 4% if I also represent the buyer. Sure, that could be in a compensation schedule, but that's not what 2C2 is. That's not what this is. Okay, this is if a buyer comes. Okay, so in our business right now, there exists a for sale by owner. Okay. In the future, once August 17th rolls around, there's a chance that there could be buyers that want to represent themselves like sellers want to represent themselves. Hey, I don't have money to pay an agent. I'm not going to take the chance of saying I will pay if the seller doesn't pay. I don't want that. I don't want to be held responsible if the seller chooses not to pay and I write an offer and get that offer accepted. I don't want to take that chance. So I don't want anybody to represent me. I'll take care of myself. What this is, if a buyer chooses to not be represented and you as agent are going to still be the person that facilitates the documents being delivered and making sure the transaction moves, it's a little extra work for you, but I don't have a fiduciary duty to that buyer. I could say, hey, listen, instead of 3%, you're going to pay me 4%, or you're going to pay me 3.5% if there is a buyer that is not represented by an agent, including myself. But I have to do more work. So you're going to pay me this addition. Instead of 3%, you'll pay me this much, 1%, 0.5%, because it's additional compensation. I put the math in the wrong. It's additional compensation. So you're paying me 3%. I'm going to get an additional 1% if there is a buyer that buys the property that is not represented by an agent. Okay. So there was a message in the chat. What about double lending? I think I covered that already. If you're double lending the deal and you haven't put something here in this compensation schedule that addresses if I represent the buyer's agent from the beginning, then you still have, even if you have that in there, even if you have that compensation schedule as a buyer's agent, even if you're the listing agent also, you have to have some kind of buyer representation and broker compensation form signed. There are new forms, right? You could do the full-on BRBC, but there is also some limited property and short-term representation that you could fill out before you show them the property and write the offer. So double lending is not going to be the same. It's not automatic that I get paid as the listing agent. I can negotiate that. I can negotiate that here maybe in the listing agreement. Again, I'm not sure how enforceable that's going to be to compel them to pay for a buyer's agent's commission, or I can negotiate in my offer based on the strength of the offer. So I hope that that answered the question about double ending. And okay, so then I got Carlos says, are you going to have a training for that? I don't know what for that is. So chances are probably yeah, but I don't know what for that is. So I can't definitively say yes. Go ahead, Darwin.
Okay, boss, let's say I charge 5%. What would you recommend? Leave 5% and then mark what it says, see attached compensation schedule, or let's say 3% and leave 2% where it just says you were saying about the additional compensation.
Okay.
What would be the best scenario?
No. Okay, so first of all, you guys have to throw out the idea that there is compensation for the buyer's agent. Forget it. Forget that it exists. This is the compensation that you're getting paid solely for the seller side of the transaction. That's it. That's why I'm saying I'm not sure in this compensation schedule that we can write in there that there's any compensation being paid to me for the buyer or to any buyer's agent. So I'm telling you that I don't know that that's going to be enforceable, or you can, because if we look at it, it says only seller side of the transaction in this section. So my belief, 90% of my belief on compensation is there is not a way for us to compel the seller to pay any compensation for the representation of a buyer. Period. End of story. Even if the listing agent is bringing the buyer, I still have to negotiate just like any other buyer's agent would for them to pay my compensation for representing that buyer. This 1% or 2% or 0.5% or whatever you negotiate with the seller is only for buyers that are not represented. They don't have representation. Not myself as listing agent. I'm not technically double ending it. It's not me. I'm just getting extra compensation because I have to do a little more work when there's a buyer that doesn't have representation. Okay. So I feel like maybe I should have never even mentioned this compensation schedule. I think that what we have to go back to is this is solely the compensation that the seller is going to pay the listing agent. Any compensation outside of that has to be negotiated in the offer. Period. End of story. That's how it's going to work. There is no compensation schedule form that's already done. It's just you would type it up and make it attached to this. You would use an addendum for that. Yeah, I mean, we've done trainings on the buyer representation agreement previously, but yeah, there is a new one. And yes, prior to the 17th, when you guys have to use it, yes, I will make sure that I do trainings on the buyer agreement. Let's see, double lending with an investor buyer. If I negotiate 5% with my seller for just listing and I want the investor to pay me 2% for the buyer side, that's fine. I can make 7%. Yes. Well, okay, let me rephrase that. You're double lending. Okay. So if you structure it that you're getting 5% for just representing the seller, and then in your buyer representation agreement, you either have the seller pay that 2%, the buyer pay that 2% when they sign the buyer representation broker compensation, or you ask for that additional 2% from the seller in the offer when you negotiate, then yeah, technically, well, if you ask for it from the seller, yeah, technically, yes, as a double lender, you could make 7%. Yes. Yeah. Now we go through it doing the math. If I have a representation agreement and the buyer is going to pay me 2% and the seller is going to pay me 5% because that's what my listing agreement said, then yes, you're going to get 7%. Yeah, you're going to get 7%. I was trying to think of a way like you wouldn't, but yeah, you're going to get the 7%. So yeah, if you guys can work it, go for it. All right. So Let's see. Okay, Lulu's got a question. Hold on. Go ahead, Lulu.
So going back to talking to the seller about the buyer's commission, since we can't negotiate it here, when we do our seller's net sheet, can we put like a pad in there, like give a seller an idea as to how much
You
the
could do well, yeah,
offers-
of course. Yeah, of course. It look, here's the thing that we have to still explain to them the benefit of them agreeing to pay compensation to a buyer's representation, right? I mean, because it is a benefit. It's going to be harder to sell a house when a buyer's agent is not directing their clients to it, right? And even if they're not willing to pay compensation, it means it's going to be harder for us to sell also. Because if we can't get paid, then we can't represent the buyer. And it's going to be a longer and a harder process, which means they're probably not going to get their full price that they want. They're not going to have the escrow is not going to work the same way. So it's going to be incumbent upon us as the listing agents to be the ones to explain to the seller, look, yes, technically at this point, you are not compelled to pay any compensation to a buyer's agent. Zero. There's nothing. Not in this listing agreement, not in the book, not the MLS, nothing. We can't fall back on anything saying, hey, well, we have to because that's the rules, right? That's what we used to do. I wish you didn't have to, but we have to. It's the rules. That's not the case anymore. So now it's going to be based on our skills as listing agents to go in and say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here's the truth. You are not compelled to pay that compensation. But here's what they don't tell you about that. It's going to diminish the amount of buyers that we have. It's going to diminish the amount of motivation that people have to write an offer on it, because if you're not willing to pay their agent, and right now buyers don't have the money with the prices and the interest rates where they're at, buyers don't, not all, most of the buyers do not have the money to pay their agents to represent them and help us get through a smooth and quick transaction. Which means that buyers that can't do that, if there is no compensation, even for the listing agent to step in and become that buyer's agent, they're going to do this on their own, which is going to draw out the transaction. And because buyers start to feel like, well, you're not paying anybody else to represent me, I'm doing it on my own, you're saving money, I'm going to write offers lower than what the list price is. And so we're going to have to deal with over and over again how we're going to get you up to the price that really is the true market value, because people have this opinion that they're getting a deal because, well, you're paying less money, so you're netting more money. So that means my offer can be less because you're not paying that commission. That's going to be their belief for a while. So we have to make a decision. You want this dollar amount? Here's what you would net at that dollar amount without paying compensation to anybody but myself. Here's what you would net if we offer some kind of compensation to a buyer's broker. And now we're not going to offer that anywhere. They're going to have to negotiate that on their offers. And remember, this number could change depending on the strength of the offers we get. We're not obligated to pay them this amount. I'm just putting in there, hey, let's offer 2%. Let's say that we're willing to go to 2% in commissions. We don't have to go all the way to 2% because it's dependent on how strong the offer is. If they don't make us an offer that makes sense for you to pay that 2%, then we could tell them, no, the compensation is going to be 1%. Okay. So it's just going to be our conversations and how we're going to negotiate these offers. And that's it. And like I have talked about with you guys in the past, I might get an offer from Lulu and go, you know what? I've known Lulu for years. I think she does a great job. She's a good agent. I feel like we're going to get through this transaction really quick. I know that you wanted to pay, 1.5 or, 1% or whatever, but I think if we pay her 2, it's going to mean we're going to get a good offer and we're going to get, a fast close and we're going to get what you want because I trust her. It may be the opposite. I may, Adrian submitted this offer, man. I've had more than one bad transaction with them. He drags his feet. He doesn't communicate well. I don't think we should pay him the full 2%. Let's offer him 1%. And if they don't choose to take it, then that's on them. But I don't think that we're going to have a good transaction. So I'm okay with that. I mean, I wouldn't have any problem saying that. Now, if that was my only offer, I'm probably not going to do that. But that's negotiable. That's the point. The offers now, the commission is negotiable. So sellers aren't compelled to pay that money. Let's see. Alvaro had a question first. Go ahead, Alvaro.
Hello, Kyle.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. So Kyle, if we have a seller who decides they do not want to work with a buyer who's not represented by an agent, will that seller be doing something wrong, something illegal, or is that a decision they can make?
Well, I
Solely
mean,
based
if
on not an agent.
look, here's the thing. If the buyer that doesn't have an agent submits some kind of an offer, and I don't know how they would do that,
Right.
to be honest, you would still have to present it. Whether they chose to accept that offer or not, that's their prerogative.
Oh, right. We would have to do our job by presenting it. But if they've already said, hey, I just don't want to deal with that.
I mean, if you get something in writing from a seller that says, hey, listen, we will not be dealing with any buyers that don't have representation. I mean, you have to do what your buyers or what your sellers are instructing you to do. But I would suggest that it be in writing, not just a conversation.
Okay. Thank you.
Daniel, go ahead.
Hey, Kyle, thank you so much for taking your time and being detailed on this. So I have a question in regards to the compensation to the seller's broker, which is us as the listing agent. Say hypothetically, we take the listing for 2%, right? 2% only. But there is a buyer. Technically speaking, we are working under a brokerage, which is Century 20 and All Stars. So wouldn't that be, if a buyer came from this office, from another agent in this office, would that be additional compensation to the other buyer, to the other agent?
No, it still have to be negotiated.
Well, yeah, no, you would negotiate it with the seller. Say, I meet with the seller, say, hey, seller's broker, 3%. Additional brokerage, or for a person who is not represented, a buyer who does not have representation, I negotiate 2%. And now we're at 5%. Well, out of their pocket, it's 5%, right?
Yeah.
So if because we're Century 21 All Stars and we're under the brokerage, not necessarily it's me as an individual receiving the 3%, but under the brokerage,
no, it doesn't work that way. No, it doesn't work that way.
Do you understand what I'm saying, though, right?
Yeah, I do. I understand what you're saying, but this specifically is a buyer that is unrepresented. So if they're represented by an agent, that's not a buyer that's unrepresented. So that 2% doesn't apply to that buyer. That 2% doesn't apply to that buyer's agent. It doesn't work that way. No.
Okay. I'm trying to find the loopholes of everything.
There is no loophole, guys.
Okay.
All compensation for the buyer's agent has to be negotiated with the offer. Period. End of story. There is no loophole. Every buyer's agent, whether it's the listing agent double lending it, or it's another agent in this office, or it's an agent from outside, is going to have a buyer representation and broker compensation agreement prior to showing a property and prior to submitting an offer. Period. End of story. That's how it works. There is no loopholes here. The buyer's agent has to negotiate their compensation. I'm going to tell you something. Commercial agents, if they decide to get into real estate, into residential real estate, are going to kick your guys' ass, because they've been doing this forever. They negotiate every bit of compensation with their offers. There's nothing promised to them in compensation. There's nothing promised. They negotiate it with every offer. And if they decide to get into residential real estate where they're not worried about if the buyer's agent's going to get paid or not, they're going to blow you guys away, because they don't worry about it. And they're going to go through the numbers and they're going to know how to negotiate it. So we have to get into that mindset. Forget about it. There is no promise of buyer compensation from the seller ever again. It is either your buyer's going to pay it or you negotiate it in the offer. That's it. Okay, let's see who is next here. I think Jesus was next. Go ahead.
Yes, Kyle. To piggyback on Alvaro's question, if someone wants to represent themselves without an agent, wouldn't be wise to put on the commission schedule that we would charge another percent if that scenario would happen? One.
So you're saying if a buyer doesn't want representation, they want to represent themselves, and they submit an offer.
Yes.
You don't have to put that on the compensation schedule, because that's what this section is for right here. If you want 1% extra because that buyer is buying the property and doesn't have an agent, that's what this is. It's already there. You don't need to put it in the compensation schedule.
Thank you.
And let's see, Maricela.
Hi, Kyle. Good morning. Question.
Morning.
If our buyer pays agrees to pay 1.5%, we could still ask the seller to pay another percent, right?
No.
Like at 1%.
No, you can't. You can't. Okay, so you're talking about are you talking about if you double lend or you're just the buyer's agent only?
If I'm just a buyer's agent only and my buyer says I'm only willing to pay you 1.5%, and I'm like, well, my fee is 2.5%. So he's like, can you then ask for the 1% from the seller?
Not unless you amend your buyer representation agreement to show 2.5%. The maximum money that you can make as a buyer's agent is what's written in your buyer representation and compensation agreement. So if you don't have 2.5 there, it doesn't matter if the seller wants to pay you 4, you're making 1.5. Whatever you have written in there is what you're making. Now, if you write an offer and negotiate, or you talk to a listing agent, like I call you, Maricel, and I say, listen, I got this fantastic buyer. They've got 30% down. They got 800 credit scores. They're already DU approval. All we need is an appraisal. But they just they just have enough money to make their down payment, to get that payment that makes sense for them. Is your seller willing to pay? And you're like, yeah, actually, my seller's going to pay you 3%. Okay, fine. We're going to submit it in the offer. I have to go back to my buyer, amend my buyer representation agreement to 3% because I only had 1.5, and then submit the offer with the SPBB and a copy of the buyer representation agreement and all that stuff to get paid the 3%. But if I have only a 1.5 and I don't change that BRBC to match what the seller's going to pay, all the seller has to pay me is 1.5, period. Okay?
So
that's the max.
Essentially, you could go down from commission, but you cannot go up. Like if you cover yourself and put a 3% and the seller's only going to pay 2%, you still have to go out and amend it, or
you'd still have to amend it, because now your buyer would still be on the hook for the other 1%.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. So you'd have to amend it either way. Whether they're paying you less than what the buyer's going to pay you and you don't want to put that on your buyer, then you'd have to amend it down. If they're going to pay you more than what your buyer can afford to pay you and you want to get paid that full, you'd have to amend it up. So either way has to go.
You cannot do like a range?
No.
I'm going to get between 2 and 3%.
No, you cannot.
Thank you.
Fixed amount. All right. So let's see. Hold on. Before I go to Carmen, there was a couple things here. Yes, you can put a flat fee. You don't have to put a percentage. It's right here on both of those things. You can put a flat fee on the amount of compensation they're going to pay. Are we allowed to cut that to inquire the seller's help? Absolutely. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I implore you to call the listing agent prior to showing properties, prior to writing offers. Say, hey, listen, is your seller willing to pay compensation? I need to know, right? As a matter of fact, you could even negotiate with your buyers that I'm only going to show you properties where the seller is willing to help with compensation. Not all of it, but willing to help or has concessions. Absolutely, you could do that. Absolutely. Because you know that your buyer can or can't pay what they can pay. So but you have to have some compensation in there. So if you hey, buyer, you and I agree that before we show any properties, I'm going to call the listing agent. I'm going to find out if there's any compensation out there. And you can tell me, hey, yes or no, they're not going to compensate, which means that if we write an offer, you got to compensate me. And if you can't compensate me, you're on your own. You have no representation. You make that choice. Absolutely, you could do that. 100%. Let's see one more here. Let's see. Is it possible to do a compensation for buyer representation too? Yes, it is. There is, and we'll go through that when we go. The compensation, the buyer representation, the BRBC, it's easier to say that than, so that's what I'm referring to, does have a space for a compensation schedule. Regarding disclosure, do seller and buyer parties get disclosed on all the compensation received as buyer's agents? Yeah, absolutely. If I have a buyer representation agreement, I have to disclose to my buyer prior to showing any possible compensation I'll receive from someone other than them. Okay. All right, Carmen, go ahead.
Hey, Kyle, good morning.
Good morning.
My question is, so let's say I negotiate 3% buyer compensation for my client.
Mhm.
They like a house that the seller is only paying 2.5%. So there's that 0.5%. When I submit my offer,
Mhm.
do I need to automatically adjust that compensation to 2.5%? Or can I do that after the fact? Because what if the offer doesn't get accepted and I changed it?
Yeah,
And
no,
then,
you can do it. You can do it prior to opening escrow when you get your offer accepted, so that you can
okay,
submit it
so
that
after
way.
the fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Maricela had her hand up again. Go ahead, Maricela.
Hi, one more question. Oh my gosh, I went blank. Shoot, I was thinking. I forgot my question.
It's all right. It'll come back to you. All right. Let me move on to Carlos. Go ahead.
So my question is, obviously you put the 3% for the selling broker on the attached compensation schedule. Can we put a buyer's commission in there or no?
No.
That's not allowed?
Well, no, because look, if it didn't say only seller side of the transaction, then I would probably say yes, go ahead, because it's compensation to seller's broker, and that's who you are, right? But it says only seller side of transaction. So it's really not built. It's like when we used to look at the purchase agreement and it would say like, a report, right? You check the box and people would put termite and completion in the report section. It's asking for a report, nothing else. This one is very specific that it's only seller side of the transaction. Okay. So I would say no, that you can't. Again, I can't say 100% that wouldn't be okay. I'm just saying that based on the attempts they're making to reduce any kind of commitment of the seller to pay compensation for a buyer's agent, the lengths that they're taking to do that is why I'm telling you it's not going to be good to do that. Okay. Looks like Maricela may have remembered her question.
Yes. Since these changes don't take place until August 17th, can we use the old contract and keep it that way till that time?
The old contract doesn't exist anymore in zip forms. So to use the old contract would be pretty tough.
Okay, but they're still, from right now till the 17th, like they're still able to pay out a commission. Like if
they are, but if you sign a listing agreement with this one, you cannot put a compensation that's being offered to the buyer in the MLS. It has to say 0 in the MLS with this listing agreement. So that's why I said at the very beginning of this, effectively, for those of you taking listings from yesterday forward, the new rules already apply to you. There is no promise of compensation. It has to be negotiated with all your offers going forward with this listing agreement. Period. End of story.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see. Okay, Bertha, go ahead.
So I already agreed. Well, my seller agreed at 5%.
Mm-hmm.
Can I offer on the MLS 2% buyer's concessions?
What listing agreement did you use? This one or the old one?
No, I'm gonna use this one because we just talked about it, and she says okay.
No, you can't do that.
No, I mean, but my question is on the MLS.
No. You can't. You can put that the seller's willing to pay concessions. That's it.
I can?
You can put in the private remarks, seller is willing to pay concessions. You could say up to a maximum of 2%. You could put that, but they're not required to pay all 2%. But if you use this listing agreement, and you put 5% there in paragraph 2C1, the seller's going to pay you 5%. And whatever compensation they pay, whether that's through concessions to the buyer or compensation to the buyer's agent, is going to be on top of that 5%.
I get it. Okay.
So
thank you.
You have to make sure you're explaining it right, because it's going to cost your seller. That's 7% that it costs your seller.
Yeah,
So-
no, I input 3% here, and then I can state
Yes. Well,
seller concessions to buyers to put a max to on the MLS on their private remarks.
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. And somebody put in there for listings and private remarks, are we still allowed to mention sellers willing to cooperate with buyers' expenses, closing costs? Yeah, so it's concessions. Just references as concessions. Okay. Go ahead, Wendy.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So if a buyer wants to represent themselves, where, like, do they have to use a car purchase contract, or can they use their own? Are we liable to, like, do we have to upload a contract somewhere for them? How does that work?
For the buyers that aren't represented by anybody.
Correct.
That's what you're saying. Look, that's part of why you're getting this additional compensation. What you're going to do is I could write the offer for them with what they want the terms of the offer to be, but I'm also going to have them sign a buyer non-representation agreement. I'm also, and then that's it from that point forward.
So wait,
on
if
their
they don't
own.
want to pay, if they don't want to pay me anything, but they want to submit an offer, and they get a hold of me, what do I tell them? Okay, submit the offer, and they're gonna be like,
You can
okay,
tell
and
them,
then,
hey, submit an offer the way you want, or give me the terms of your offer in a letter. I'll write it up on the contract, but I need you to sign a buyer. That's why you're getting paid this extra percentage from your seller, because you're going to do a little bit extra work to get the transaction started for a buyer that's not represented by an agent. But you're not going to represent them going forward. You're just going to send them things and they're on their own.
holy sh. So what if they just say no, nobody wants to pay? Like, my seller doesn't want to, they don't want to.
Then
and they
the buyers are on their own. Figure out a way to submit an offer. That's
and
it.
they get a contract from from Office Max or whatever, you know what I
Then
mean?
you have to present that to your sellers.
And okay. And then what, moving forward, I just give them my listing disclosures, and that
You provide the disclosures just like you would to another agent, but you don't go over them with them. You just say, here they are, you guys sign them and return them.
and then what about their disclosures or whatever? Do we need
What disclosures does a buyer have?
I don't know. I'm just asking. Like,
They
do
don't
they need
they
to
don't
do
have
that?
any disclosures.
Okay.
There's nothing else for them to provide to you after once you guys have gotten the offer and they've responded to any counters and they've returned to you, there's nothing for them. They have to live under the timelines that existed for the contract. So they have 17 days to do their inspections. If they don't do their inspection, you send them a notice to perform, you cancel on them, just like if they had an agent. It's just that you're going to be communicating directly with the buyer who's not represented. That's it.
And you guys at Century are going to accept like their purchase contract?
We don't have a choice not to.
Okay. Just wondering that, because it might happen, or they give me a break letter.
It probably will happen.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, go ahead, Arnold. All right, moving on. Go ahead, Armando.
Hello, Kyle.
Can you hear me? Okay, hold on. Arnold finally came through.
Arnold. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Sorry about that.
All right.
Hey, so Kyle, I just took a listing this week prior to this new form. I turned it in, but I just registered the listing. I haven't put it on the MLS because of the dates that the seller wants me to market. So when I mark it and then now ready to transfer it into the MLS, compensation to the cooperating broker that we've agreed to, the percentage, am I going to be able to still put that in there?
No. Well, it depends on if it goes on the market after the 17th or after the 13th or not.
So anytime before the 17th, it's still
the
available
13th,
to put in there.
The 13th for the Sierra MLS.
The 13th.
Yeah, if you put it active tomorrow, yes, you still offer the compensation.
Okay.
Yep.
And then those terms are still the same terms.
They're still the same. The only thing that you're going to need to do with them prior to the 13th of August is have them sign a disclosure and modification of listing agreement, because you have the old listing agreement. That's it. It's the only thing you're going to have to do different with them.
Yeah, that was already turned in with that.
Yeah, that's it. Then that's it. If you put it active before the 13th, then yes, you can offer the show the compensation in the MLS. But once the 13th comes, it's going to disappear.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Let's see. You're welcome. Armando, go ahead.
All right. So question here. So looking at C1 4B, compensation to seller's broker, once again, 3%. I don't get it. Why can't we put 5%? Because they're paying us. They're not paying the other agent. And then we offer the compensation to the other office.
Yeah, that's fine. The problem is that it still has to go through the offer on the SPBB. I'm not saying that. What you could say is, hey, if you're paying me 5%, but here's the problem. If you don't pay the 2%, because all right, so there's nothing for us to offer anywhere, right? Which means we're not bound to the 2%. So let's say that they gave you 5%, and then you get a really crappy offer, right? And the 2% doesn't make sense to offer to the other agent. And the other agent still has to negotiate it in the offer. They have to send you an SPBB. They have to send you a copy of the buyer representation agreement. It has to say in there that the buyer's broker is going to, as a matter of fact, let's do this. Let's do this so you guys can see it. Okay. So let's look at that form. They've erased right now, up until now, there was a section that says where the seller's broker is going to pay a compensation, and here's the difference between what the seller's going to pay and what the buyer's agent is getting paid. Okay. This now only refers to the seller paying it. Period. End of story. There is no mechanism for the seller's broker to pay compensation contractually to the buyer's agent. There's no mechanism for that. This lawsuit, NAR and everybody else, all the other brokers that settled because they were tired of they didn't want to get sued. And this is not done yet because it hasn't been approved and it could change in the future. But as of the 17th, these are the rules. There is no mechanism for the seller to pay you a commission in order for you to pay a buyer's representation. Everything now is for negotiation in the offer. Period. End of story. That's it. That's it. There's no mechanism any longer for us to pay compensation from broker to broker.
Okay.
There's no more CBC. They've removed it from the SPBB. It's gone. That's it.
Okay, so this form that you're showing me here now, the seller's payment to buyer's broker. So this is what they're going to be paying the other agent. So
they're going to be paying the responsibility of the buyer's agent. So in the purchase agreement, we're going to check a box and include this form.
Perfect. So then what I'm seeing then is, I don't know if I'm wrong. I present this on my listing agreement. You're paying me 3%, and we have them pre-fill this out. You're going to agree to pay 2% to the other agent. And we do that right ahead of time.
No. The lawsuit is very specific. We cannot compel the seller to pay compensation to the buyer's agent. That's it. We cannot compel. Well, that's fine. If they agree to it, that's fine. But it'll be negotiated in the offer. If I do it now, if I do it prior to an offer existing, then what I've done is no matter what the value of the offer is, you're committed to pay this. Right? And how many times have we had sellers that we have to argue with because they get lowball offers like, well, I don't want to pay the full commission. And then we have to go renegotiate the entire commission because we're paying the compensation to the buyer's broker. I think what you guys are looking at this all wrong. All we want our sellers is to be open to the idea of compensating buyer's broker, and it will be case by case based on the offer.
Okay, got it. Okay, then. So I mean,
that's what we have to look at is going like, look, here's the deal. Guess what? Your net sheet is not going to be determined from the beginning. It's going to say, hey, this is what your net sheet could look like if you pay this, but you don't have to pay that amount. We could get an offer that looks good. And you say, you know what, instead of paying the 2, I only want to pay 1. That's your prerogative. Absolutely. It's now negotiated. Mm-hmm. So the thing is that what they're trying to do is they're trying to give the seller the, I hate to say it this way, but the illusion of choice. But we all know that when we get through this 3 or 4 months from now, it's going to shake out to the seller's going to have to be paying compensation to buyers brokers. They're just not committing to it ahead of time.
So, Mr. Estrada, here I am today presenting you. So what you're going to pay me is right now is 3%. Most likely you're going to be paying 2%, maybe less, depending on the offer, as long as you agree to that. Once we get the offers in, we will negotiate that with the other agent. Are you okay with that? Perfect. Perfect. And then so as long as they understand it from the get-go, that there's 2%, 1%, 3%, whatever this agent's asking, it's going to be negotiable.
Absolutely. And I would put that in their net sheet. I would just say on average, most agents are probably going to ask you for 2%. You're only obligated to pay them a maximum of what's on their buyer representation agreement, but they're probably going to ask for 2%. So in your net sheet, I showed what it would look like if you agreed to pay 2%. Now, for the first couple, I think for the first couple months, we're going to be butting our head against the wall because there's going to be sellers like saying, nope. And when their property sits, they're going to start to become more and more open to the idea of, okay, we need to tell people I'm willing to pay. I think that's going to be the hurdle, is more just that sellers go, I don't have to, so I'm not. But the people who need to sell and the people who understand the process, they need us, and that's going to be the truth.
That's the normal. Now,
I think that way you said it could not be better.
Perfect. Now, number 2 here, the question I have. So now I'm a buyer's agent. Now, this whole thing about so are they going to make us like when we had the COVID thing? We have to show that we have something signed first before we show up property.
No, I don't. I haven't read or seen anything that says you have to send them a copy of your BRBC prior to showing. No, I don't think that's going to be part of it. I think what it is that it just has to exist dated prior to you requesting to be paid for for a property that they're writing an offer on. You know what I mean? Like, I think it just has to. I think it just has to exist. It's like our listing agreement basically for a buyers. That's what it is now. Is you're listing your buyers.
Okay. All right. Good.
And I think, to be honest with you guys, I think for you guys as buyers agents, it's much better. You're not going to have these wishy-washy buyers that are like, yeah, sure, show me properties. And then you find out 2 weeks later they wrote an offer with somebody else, right? This is going to be committed buyers that want to work with you because you showed them value and they chose you. I think that's ultimately, it's going to be good for you guys. It's going to be good for buyers agents. It's just going to make you have to be stronger at what you do, have more skills. That's all. Okay, Monica, we're going a little late, but that's okay because I know you guys have questions. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for this, Kyle. So just to be clear, if they are unrepresented, like a FISBO, but basically a buyer, just like you said, we give disclosures and they're on their own and God bless you and good luck, then we can put the 4C additional 1% because we're taking the time and trouble to basically deal with them, right?
Yeah, you can do that from the beginning and say, hey, listen, if I don't represent them, if they represent themselves, you're just going to pay me this extra 1 point because I have to do more work.
Right. I have to smile at them. Okay.
Yeah.
But it's not technically double lending because I'm not representing, but I'm getting a little compensation. The second part of my question is if they are my buyer, let's say that I met a buyer at an open house, prior client referral, blah, blah, blah. And I do have them under a buyer broker agreement that says 3% or less or whatever. And then they want to buy one of my listings, then that's different. At that point, I, like any other agent, would have to negotiate with the listing agent to get me paid on the second side, correct?
Absolutely, 100%. You got it.
Perfect. And at that point, I can look in the mirror and fight against myself and represent them properly, explain disclosures to them, blah, 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 like I would any other time.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
It goes right back to just like you would double end a deal now. Exactly the same.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I saw somebody put in here that Zillow has a 1 week showing agreement. We have a short-term showing agreement too here. There's 2 different ones. There's one for open house. There's one for short-term. And then there's the regular long-term one. I would suggest don't use any other forms other than the CAR forms because they're for sure vetted and make sense. The CAR form, Zillow is probably a nationwide thing. So it's probably not going to be as specific as the state of California. So I would stick with the CAR forms. Let's go with Carlos. Go ahead.
A few questions. All right, so when we do our net sheets, are we including this 1% compensation for unrepresented buyers?
If you're going to put that in your listing agreement, then I would. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and then when you
and you could now hold on one second. You could do multiple net sheets, by the way. You could say, here's a net sheet for if a buyer comes in and isn't represented. So here's your total compensation that you're going to pay. Here's if we choose to offer, here's one net sheet for if we choose to offer compensation. And here's a net sheet if we choose not to offer any compensation. You could do multiple net sheets too.
So when we're representing our sellers, do you suggest we include the seller payment to buyer's broker form as well?
Seller's payment? No. Not for the at the listing, not at the time of listing. No, that's solely for if you submit an offer because you're going to double end it. You know, a buyer shows up at your open house, you sign that short-term representation agreement, you write an offer on this property for them. Then yes, you would include your SPBB because you're asking for the seller to compensate you for representing the buyer. But in any other way, there's no need for that as far as the listing side goes.
So initially, when I take the listing, I shouldn't take this form to be like, oh, well, we're paying that 2% to the buyer's agent.
I'm sorry?
I shouldn't include this form when my client.
No, because again, we're not supposed to make it a blanket. You're paying 2% to any buyer's agent. That's not the point of this change. The point of this change is it's negotiable based on each offer. So every offer has a different chance at how they're going to get compensated. What we're trying to avoid is making the seller commit to a blanket offer of compensation, regardless of the quality of the offer, right? Because, and it could happen, right? Like we say, we put a property on market and then we don't get any offers and we finally get one offer. It's the best offer we have and it's not full price or it's asking for concessions or it's all kinds of things. But we've made them commit to paying 2% to that buyer's agent, even though the offer is not great and it's a lot of work. So that what they're doing is they're taking away that blanket saying, hey, no matter who sets an offer, if I accept that they're getting paid this, it's making it case by case basis. That's really what we're looking at.
Okay. And then last question, is the office going to have a standard for buyer's agents, or we could actually tell them to pay whatever they want, whatever they can afford?
You're talking about is there going to be like a minimum compensation or for representing a buyer?
With listings, you guys have one, right?
Well, it's a little different. It's a little different, but yeah, I mean, now on the listing side, the listing was different before because it was total compensation, what you're paying us, what I'm going to offer to the buyer's agent. So yeah, we did have a minimum because it made sense. If you took a listing for 2.5%, then 1.25% was going out, 1.25% was staying here. It didn't make sense. But now you're negotiating compensation only for your side. Right. So if your buyer can only afford to pay you 1.5% and you're okay with working for that 1.5%, who are we to tell you no? Okay, let's see. We got here. Let's see. I think that show is going to be our best friend in offering buyers commission and planting that commission to the shows. I absolutely agree with you, Tony. Giovanni, if we receive an offer as strong and we offer, let's say 2% to the buyer's agent, however, the appraisal comes in lower, we are able to negotiate compensation again, or is it? Yeah, absolutely. You can. Once you negotiate anything. So think of the seller paying the buyer's agent compensation as the seller giving a closing cost credit. Think of it in that same term. So let's say that you write an offer to me at full price or over asking price. Let's do over, right? Because then it doesn't appraise, right? You send me an over asking a purchase agreement over asking price, ask for 2%. I agree to it. And then the appraisal comes in and it's got to come down $15,000, right? Because of the appraised value. So it comes down to, let's say, my original list price. And you say, well, we would like for you to reduce the price to the appraised value because that's what it appraised at. Great, I will reduce to appraised value, but now I'm not paying the compensation any longer. Absolutely, a seller, I would have the right to do that, just like any other credit or any other concession that I was paying. Once one thing is now negotiated, everything is up for negotiation. Okay. So good question, Gio. Yes, absolutely. Real quick, I want to run through this just so you guys can see it's the normal listing agreement. This was the part that was going to be the biggest, but real quick, I want to run through this just so we can get done with it, because next week I want to talk about the buyer representation agreement, putting it together with the purchase agreement. I want to do all that next week. So we're going to go a little bit longer. Give me another 5 minutes, guys. Please hang in there. I appreciate it. Okay, continuing right of compensation. That's that section that used to be in the purchase agreement where we put like 180 days. If this listing expires or cancels and I give you a list of names for the next 180 days, you would owe me a commission based on those people purchasing the property. That's what this section is. So this would be the 180 that we had talked about previously on our old listing agreement. This seller obligation to pay previous brokers. This would be who the previous listing agent was if it was an expired. Compensation owed if the property is sold to, that would be this list of exceptions that I would have to deliver. Another broker would have to do that. Okay. Items included, items excluded, pretty straightforward, right? Leased items, you're now checking off a box for what's leased. Anything that's a lien, you're going to put that. You're going to list any of the smart home features that the seller is going to leave or smart home features that the seller is going to exclude. Property will be marketed in the MLS, in the following MLS. Your primary MLS is the CRMLS, right? We all know that. That's our primary MLS. If for some reason you were going to put it in some secondary MLS, you could add that there, okay? There's a new form now called the MLSA, which is the Multiple Listing Service Addendum, which discloses what happens in the MLS now that used to be referenced in the listing agreement. It's not there any longer. The timing and presentation of offers. I like this. It gives you, it says, seller instructs broker to present all offers received as soon as practicable, or give you a date that says, I want all my offers presented on, on August 1st. Okay. Let's see, buyer supplemental offer letters, seller instruction. So those are the love letters. It's either yes, that we're not going to get those, or if I check the box, yeah, go ahead, send me the love letters. You can now put in here what the reports are. The NHG is by default. It has to be put in there, but you could put in there that, hey, the seller's going to agree to do these specific things. Okay. Or like here, you could put city presale inspection reports in there. If there's any exemptions to the ownership and title for them, if the seller is going to be using an SPRP, so they're going to be contingent on finding a replacement property. They don't want a key safe or a sign. This is if you check this box, they don't want one. That's an opt-out. So don't check that if you're going to put a lockbox or a sign up, and any additional terms that you wanted to do. Now, these are the addendums and the advisories that would be attached. And then now we get into the explanation of the compensation and how those work. Okay. So I know that as we go forward, I just wanted to make sure that you guys were aware this existed because you're already having to use it. Okay. But we'll do more in depth like we've always done. Read every paragraph. We'll go through it. We'll do the whole thing. But next week, I want to go through the BRBC and some of the other forms that are going to be coming as we get through to August. I'm just going to keep reviewing and reviewing until we get to August, because I want you guys to be ultimately prepared and not caught off guard. And I know it's scary, and I know it seems like it's going to be the Wild West, as somebody said in the text, in the chat. But I know that you guys listening here are professionals, and you're going to figure it out. And I promise you, I will help you the best I can to figure it out. But we're going to get there. And we got 3 more weeks, 3 or a little bit more than that before this really happens. So, before it goes into effect, and so I'm going to do my best over the next 3 weeks that we're going to talk about this every chance I get, so that we can go through it. I think there's a couple questions left in the chat, so I can do that before I finish. If seller's only willing to pay 1%, can buyer pay us the other 1%? Yes, they can. Tony, yes, they can. How can it be added to another MLS? Well, you could be a member of multiple MLSs, and you could put those in the other MLSs if you wanted to do that. And I got some thank yous, so I appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much. This is going to be on YouTube a little bit later today. I know, again, it's a lot of information, and I'm really not expecting you guys to get it the first time. So I'm here. You can call. I'm so glad that there were at one point 100 people on this class, because I was a little nervous that people were going to, kind of blow it off. But I'm glad there was 100 people to begin with. We're losing people as we get to the end, and I get it. It's lunchtime. Everybody's hungry. The brain stops working when you're hungry. But again, it'll be there on YouTube. You could go back and look at it. You can email me. You can text me. You can come see me in person. I promise you, I will have this conversation with you as many times as you guys need it to feel comfortable. So thank you again for being here. Go out, be productive, and don't worry, everything's going to be okay.